In a small village surrounded by majestic mountains and fertile fields, lived a young farmer named Luke. He was known in the village for his kindness and for always helping those in need, but his own life was filled with challenges. That year's harvest had been sparse due to a long drought, and the loss of his family in a tragic accident had left Luke desolate and hopeless. Despite his efforts to care for his small property, he saw his resources dwindling day by day, and a shadow of despair was beginning to settle in his heart. Days dragged by like prisoners chained to time. Luke's eyes, once full of life, now reflected only the emptiness of someone who had lost everything. His calloused hands from hard labor seemed to search the dry soil for something beyond grains, perhaps a sign, an answer to the silence the sky offered him. The walls of the small house that once housed laughter and conversations now echoed only the sound of loneliness, a faithful and relentless companion that followed him like his own shadow. On the darkest nights, when silence seemed to suffocate even the crickets in the fields, Luke would sit at the door of his cabin and gaze at the stars. He remembered the stories his father used to tell about how each star represented a soul that had left this world. "Are you up there?" he would murmur as silent tears traced paths on his dusty face. "Can you see me here, lost and aimless?" One morning, while walking along a trail in search of solutions, Luke encountered a mysterious figure. It was an elderly woman with silver hair like moonlight and deep eyes that seemed to reflect the wisdom of 1,000 lives. She wore simple clothes, but there was something in her presence that conveyed unusual dignity. She introduced herself as Clara, a traveler passing through the village in search of stories to tell. Seeing Luke's sorrow, she approached him like one would approach an injured animal, with care and respect. "Young man," she said in a voice reminiscent of leaves whispering in the wind, "your eyes carry the weight of the world. What burden is it that bends your shoulders?" Luke hesitated. It had been so long since he had shared his thoughts with anyone that his words seemed stuck in his throat, like birds that had forgotten how to fly. But there was something in Clara's eyes, a silent understanding that invited him to speak. Through tears that came without warning, like a storm on a clear day, Luke poured out his struggles, his loneliness, and the feeling that everything was lost. He spoke of the drought that had ravaged his lands, the accident that had taken his family, and the days he woke up not knowing if it was worth continuing. Painful words escaped his lips like blood from an open wound, while Clara listened attentively, without interrupting or judging. "Sometimes I think it would be better to give up," Luke confessed, his voice choked with emotion. "What do I have left here? A land that refuses to bear fruit, a house empty of voices and hearts. Every day I feel myself sinking deeper into an endless pit, and the ropes that could save me are out of my reach." Clara listened carefully and in the end smiled. It wasn't a superficial smile of joy, but the kind of smile that carries understanding and compassion. Her eyes sparkled as if they held an ancient secret, about to be revealed. "Let me tell you a story," she said, sitting on a nearby stone by the path. "The story of a rose I met during my travels." Luke sat on the dusty ground, like a child ready to hear a bedtime fable. The gentle breeze swayed the branches of the trees, creating a soft melody that cradled the elder's words. "In a distant land," Clara began, "there was an arid field, scorched by the sun and abandoned by men. Nothing grew there except stones and despair. Travelers avoided that place, calling it the Valley of Shadows, because they believed that even sunlight lost its brightness upon touching that land. One day, without anyone knowing how, a small rose seed was carried by the wind to that desolate field. It fell among the stones and, against all odds, found a small pocket of moist soil. There, protected by the very obstacles that should have prevented its growth, the seed began its silent work. Days, weeks, months passed. The seed fought against the aridity, the relentless heat, the lack of nutrients. Its roots stretched deep, seeking water in the earth's depths. Its stem, still fragile, slowly rose, like a silent prayer to the sky. Thorns grew to protect it from hungry animals that might devour it. A traveler passing by noticed that green spot amid the desolation. Curious, he approached and saw the miracle, a rosebud, still closed but full of promise. Impressed, the traveler deviated from his original path and went to the nearest village to tell what he had seen. People laughed at him. A rose in the Valley of Shadows? Impossible, they said. The sun must have affected his mind, others mocked. But among them was an old wise man who listened to the story attentively. "Let's see that rose," he said. And so, a small group set out for the valley, more out of curiosity than belief. When they arrived, astonishment overcame them all. There, it was, a red rose fully bloomed, emanating a fragrance that seemed otherworldly. Its petals, a deep red like the blood of the earth, shimmered under the sun as if made of velvet and dew. And around it, they noticed something even more surprising. Small patches of green began to emerge in the previously barren soil. The rose had not only survived, it was transforming the valley. Its fragrance attracted bees and butterflies. Its roots paved the way for water to penetrate the ground. Its beauty defied the surrounding desolation. People began to visit the valley, not to avoid it anymore, but to behold the miracle. They brought water, cared for the surrounding soil, and planted other seeds. In a few years, the Valley of Shadows became known as the Solitary Rose Valley, a pilgrimage site for those who had lost hope and sought a sign that life always finds a way. Clara paused, her eyes fixed on some distant point, as if she could see that rose beyond the horizon of time. "See, Luke," she continued, turning her gaze back to the young man. "Sometimes what seems lost is just an opportunity to be reborn. Beauty and faith can sprout in the most inhospitable grounds. That rose didn't know the soil was barren, that the climate was hostile, that everyone had given up on that place. It simply did what was in its nature, to grow, to bloom, to perfume the world." Luke listened, absorbed. Clara's words fell into his heart like raindrops on thirsty soil. For a brief moment he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a spark of possibility, a breath of life amidst the ashes of his dreams. "How can I be like that rose?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "How can I bloom when everything around me seems dead?" Clara smiled again, and this time her smile lit up her face like the rising sun. "Look inside yourself, Luke. The seed is already there, waiting. All you need to do is nourish it with faith and water it with hope. The rest will come naturally, like a flower blooming in response to the sun's call." With those words, the elder stood up, adjusted her travel bag on her shoulder, and prepared to continue her journey. Before leaving, she placed a small object in Luke's hand. "A gift," she said, "to remember our conversation." It was a seed, small, ordinary, nothing that distinguished it from any other, but in Luke's eyes it seemed to shine with its own light. "Thank you," he murmured, closing his fingers around the seed as if it were the most precious treasure. Clara nodded and, without another word, continued on her way. Luke stayed there, watching her until her silhouette disappeared around the bend of the trail. Then, he looked at the seed in his hand and felt something strange happening in his chest. A subtle movement, as if his heart, which had been dormant for so long, was beginning to awaken. Inspired by Clara's words, Luke decided he would not let himself be overcome. With renewed determination, he tucked the seed into his pocket and returned home. Along the way, something curious happened. He began to notice details that had previously gone unnoticed. The green of the leaves seemed more vivid, the birds' songs more melodious. Even the air felt lighter in his lungs. Upon arriving home, he sat at the table, and for the first time in a long while, allowed himself to remember not just the loss of his family, but the lessons and traditions they had left him. His father always said that the land was alive and that it listened to those who treated it with respect. His mother had taught him that patience was the most valuable of virtues, and that the sweetest fruits were those that took the longest to ripen. With these memories in mind, Luke realized that he had ignored an ancestral knowledge that ran in his veins. His family had always valued resilience and a connection to the land. They were not just farmers. They were guardians of a deep understanding of the cycles of life, death, and rebirth. The next morning, at sunrise, Luke made a decision that would change his life forever. With the image of the rose in the desert still vivid in his mind, he decided to dig a well on his property. There were no guarantees he would find water, but something inside him, perhaps the seed Clara had planted in his heart, told him that this was the right direction. He selected a spot near his house where the trees seemed greener and the soil less parched. Armed with a shovel, a bucket, and renewed determination, Luke began to dig. Each swing of the shovel into the earth was an act of faith, each inch of depth an affirmation that he believed in a better future. The first few hours were encouraging, fueled by initial enthusiasm. But as the sun climbed higher, in the sky and the heat intensified, the task became increasingly arduous. Sweat trickled down his face, mixing with the dust and forming streams of mud on his skin. His muscles, unused to intense labor after months of apathy, protested with every movement. By the end of the first day, Luke had dug a considerable hole, but there was no sign of water. Exhausted, he lay down on his bed, feeling every fiber of his aching body. Before falling asleep, he touched the seed Clara had given him, now kept in a small pouch hanging around his neck. "Tomorrow," he whispered, "tomorrow I will continue." The second day was even harder. The initial excitement had faded, and the reality of the monumental task he had undertaken began to weigh on his shoulders. The ground became harder as he dug deeper, and large rocks blocked his path, requiring extra effort to remove. In the middle of the afternoon, Luke sat by the edge of the hole, disheartened. "Maybe I'm being foolish," he thought. "Maybe there's no water here and I'm wasting the little strength I have left." It was in that moment of weakness that he heard a sound, faint at first, then clearer. It was the song of a bird, a simple yet beautiful melody that seemed directed especially at him. Looking up, he saw a bluebird perched on a nearby branch, its small body standing out against the sky. Luke smiled. "Did you come to give me courage, little friend?" In response, the bird sang again, a sequence of notes that seemed to say, "Continue, continue." And Luke did. Day after day, sun after sun, he kept digging. Sometimes frustration threatened to overwhelm him, and the desire to give up became almost irresistible. But then, he remembered the rose in the desert, the seed in his heart, Clara's words, and he kept going. Each shovelful of earth he removed was accompanied by memories of his parents and the belief that if he maintained his faith, he could find water. In the hardest moments, he recited like a mantra the stories his father told about ancestors who had faced even worse droughts and found ways to survive. As days passed, something began to change in Luke. Not just his body, which grew stronger from constant labor, but also his spirit. The pain from losing his family was still there, a constant presence in his heart, but now it was accompanied by something new, a sense of purpose, a renewed connection to life. In that moment of struggle, Luke began to notice the small successes around him, the songs of birds that seemed to accompany his work, wildflowers blooming at the edges of his property, the gentle breeze caressing his face during the hottest parts of the day. These were simple blessings, easily overlooked in days of despair, but now they shone like little gems in his consciousness. One afternoon, after nearly 2 weeks of uninterrupted work, Luke noticed something different. The soil at the bottom of the well, which had already reached almost 5 meters deep, looked darker, more moist. With his heart racing, he increased his efforts. Every shovelful of dirt he removed confirmed his suspicion. He was nearing water. As the sun began to set, tinting the sky with orange and purple hues, Luke felt a change in the ground beneath his feet. A soft sound, almost imperceptible, reached his ears, the sound of water moving in the depths. With renewed vigor, he continued digging, now using his hands, feeling the moist earth between his fingers. Suddenly, a small spurt of water burst from the ground, soaking his hands and splashing his face. The sound of water gushing filled his ears like the most beautiful music, and as he dug deeper, he found a spring that seemed to bring life itself. Luke fell to his knees, tears mixing with the water that now rose rapidly, forming a small pool around him. They were not tears of sadness like the ones he had shed for months, but of gratitude, of relief, of a joy so intense it seemed too vast for his chest. "Thank you," he whispered, not knowing exactly whom to thank. God, his parents' memory, the mysterious Clara, or the very earth that now offered him its most precious treasure. "Thank you for not letting me give up." That night, Luke slept deeply for the first time in months, lulled by the gentle murmur of water continuing to spring from the well. His dreams were filled with rose bushes blooming in arid lands and bluebirds singing melodies of hope. The next morning, barely believing what had happened, Luke went to the village. As he walked through the narrow streets, he noticed how people looked at him differently, no longer with pity or discomfort, as they had in the days after the tragedy, but with curiosity. There was something in his walk, in his gaze, that drew attention. "Luke," called one of the villagers, a middle-aged man who worked as a blacksmith. "Long time no see. How are you?" Luke smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his face like the rising sun. "I found water on my property," he said, unable to contain the excitement in his voice. "A well right near the house." The news spread quickly, like fire on dry grass. In a region ravaged by drought, the discovery of a new water source was cause for celebration. Soon Luke was surrounded by neighbors who wanted to know more, who congratulated him, who expressed astonishment and admiration for what he had accomplished alone. "How did you know where to dig?" asked an elderly woman, her wrinkled eyes shining with curiosity. Luke hesitated. How could he explain meeting Clara, the story of the rose, the seed he now carried close to his heart? How could he talk about faith and hope to people who struggled daily just to survive? "I felt it," he finally replied. "Something told me the water was there, waiting." To his surprise, no one laughed or mocked his answer. On the contrary, there were nods of understanding, as if that simple explanation made perfect sense in a world where so many things remained inexplicable. "You're lucky, son," said an older man, giving friendly pats on his shoulder. "Or maybe it's more than luck." Returning home that day, Luke carried with him more than the provisions he had bought in the village. He also carried a renewed sense of belonging, of being part of a community that, despite its hardships, continued to move forward. In the following days, Luke worked to improve the well. He built a simple structure around it to protect the water and facilitate its collection. He planted nearby trees, knowing their roots would help keep the soil firm and prevent landslides. And, in a small symbolic act that meant a lot to him, he planted the seed Clara had given him in a special spot near the well. Soon, his property began to show signs of recovery. With regular access to water, Luke was able to irrigate a small garden where he planted vegetables and herbs. The chickens, which had thined out during the drought, now pecked happily in the revitalized backyard. Even the fruit trees, which had seemed on the brink of death months before, displayed green buds and promises of future harvests. But the most significant transformation wasn't in the land, it was in the people. News of Luke's well had spread beyond the village, attracting visitors from distant places. Many came out of curiosity, others out of need. And Luke, remembering his days of despair, did not turn anyone away from the water. One day, a group of families arrived at his door. They were thin, with worn clothes and eyes that had seen more suffering than joy. They came from an even more drought-stricken region, where many had already died of hunger and thirst. "We heard about your water," said the group's leader, a tall and dignified man despite his condition. "We traveled 3 days to get here. Could you help us?" Luke looked at those people, men, women, children, and the elderly, and saw in them the reflection of his own past pain. Without hesitation, he pointed the way to the well. "Water is a gift," he said. "It belongs to no one more than it does to the clouds or the rivers. Drink, refresh yourselves, take what you need." The gratitude in those people's eyes was a reward, greater than any material treasure could be. As they quenched their thirst and filled their containers, Luke felt a deep peace settle in his heart. It was as if each sip of water he offered washed away a little more of the bitterness that had once consumed him. Some of those families decided to stay. With Luke's permission, they settled on nearby lands, building simple huts and starting their own gardens. Luke not only shared his water, but also his knowledge. He taught them cultivation techniques that could rejuvenate the exhausted land, showing how each plant had its place and purpose, how every human action could be an act of healing or destruction. "The land speaks to us," he said, repeating his father's words. "We just need to learn how to listen." Over time, the small village transformed. The water brought plants and richness to the soil, allowing each house to have what it needed. New buildings arose, new paths were opened, new voices filled the air that was once silent. The community, which had once lived in despair, now thrived, in unity and cooperation. Luke, without realizing it or seeking such a position, became a leader of the community, not by force or ambition, but by the natural respect people felt for him. In meetings held under the shade of a large tree near the well, his voice was heard attentively, and his advice, always thoughtful and compassionate, helped resolve disputes and plan for the future. He promoted solidarity and mutual aid among the villagers, encouraging exchange systems that benefited everyone. When someone faced difficulties, a bad harvest, an illness, any setback, the community mobilized to help, just as they had done for him in his darkest moments. Amid his new responsibilities, Luke never forgot Clara and her story about the rose in the desert. Often, when he walked through the now lush fields, he imagined where she might be, what other stories she was telling, what other lives she was touching with her wisdom. One afternoon, while overseeing the construction of a new irrigation system that would bring water to more distant fields, Luke spotted a familiar figure on the road leading to the village. His heart raced as he recognized the serene walk, the silver hair, the dignity that radiated even from a distance. Clara had returned. Leaving his tools behind, Luke ran to meet the elder, not caring about the curious glances that followed him. When he was close enough to see her face, he noticed she was smiling, as if she had been expecting this moment. "You're back," he said, unable to hide the emotion in his voice. "I promised myself I would return to see how the young man with the sad eyes I met on that trail was doing," she replied, her gaze sweeping the transformed landscape. "But it seems he no longer exists." Luke smiled, understanding the meaning behind her words. Indeed, the man he was, the lost, hopeless one, consumed by pain, had given way to someone new, someone who had rediscovered the purpose and meaning of life. "Come," he invited, offering his arm to Clara. "There's so much I want to show you." As they walked together toward the village, Luke recounted everything that had happened since their last meeting. The well, the water, the people who came, the community that flourished. He also spoke about the seed she had given him, now a small plant growing near the well. "It hasn't bloomed yet," he explained with a touch of disappointment in his voice. "But it grows a little each day." Clara smiled, that mysterious smile that seemed to hold the secrets of the universe. "The most beautiful flowers are those that take the longest to bloom," she said. "And some flowers, Luke, are not made of petals, but of actions and choices that transform the world around us." Upon arriving in the village, Clara was greeted with curiosity and respect. The children especially were drawn to her, gathering around to hear the wonderful stories she told about distant lands and extraordinary people. During her stay, which lasted several weeks, Clara and Luke often met at dusk, sitting near the well. That had changed everything. They shared new stories of overcoming and transformation, of people who, like the rose in the desert, had bloomed in impossible circumstances. Her lessons became a guide for Luke in his new role as a leader, and their meetings were always filled with laughter, learning, and gratitude. Luke realized that despite her apparent physical fragility, Clara possessed an unshakable inner strength, a wisdom that came not just from books and studies, but from experiences lived in all their intensity. "How did you know?" he asked one night, as they watched the stars reflected on the calm surface of the well's water. "How did you know I would find water? That all of this," he gestured to the thriving village, "would be possible?" Clara remained silent for a moment, her eyes fixed on the night sky. "I didn't know," she finally replied, "just as the rose didn't know it would bloom in the desert. But I saw in you what we all possess and few recognize, the ability to rise from our own ashes, to find light even in the deepest darkness." When the time came for Clara to leave, the entire village gathered to bid her farewell. Children handed her flowers picked from the fields. Women offered breads and sweets for her journey. Men bowed in respect. Luke, with a heavy yet peaceful heart, accompanied her to the start of the trail that would take her away. "I will return," she promised, holding Luke's hands in hers. "Perhaps when that seed blooms its first flower, I will be waiting," he replied, knowing that regardless of when or if she returned, her presence would remain alive in everything he had helped create. Luke's story spread throughout the region, passed from mouth to mouth, sometimes embellished, other times simplified, but always carrying its essence. It became a symbol of hope for communities ravaged by drought, a reminder that even in the hardest moments, perseverance and faith can open paths where there was once only desolation. Travelers passing through the village returned to their lands, with stories about the man of the well, as Luke came to be known. They spoke of how he had transformed a property on the brink of ruin into an oasis of life and prosperity, of how he had built not just a well, but an entire community based on values of cooperation and mutual respect. These stories inspired people to believe that even when everything seems lost, the key to change lies within each one. Some, moved by Luke's example, found the courage to face their own challenges, to dig their own metaphorical wells in search of water,